Story 1. Having to write down passwords on a sheet of paper so you can continue your progress. You did not even have the option to take a photo of the screen, since cameras were not instant back then. Story 2. Controlling games these days is fairly standardized and generally very responsive. However, there was a period when this was not the case. Many otherwise good games were hampered by confusing control schemes that could not be reconfigured and bore no resemblance to similar games. Story 3. Dad had a computer that was ancient even in the 1990s. I played DOS games on it. I remember having to select the sound card and correct settings every time I loaded a game, choosing between CGA, EGA, VGA, and SVGA video modes. Games often included some form of digital rights management where you had to type a specific word from the manual or enter a code from the code wheel when you turned it in some way. Story 4. Having to set up the game's sound. Input, output address. Interrupt request line. Direct memory access channel. Story 5. Having to change different compact discs to complete the game. Diablo 2 has a compact disc for each act. Lose or break a compact disc, and you lose 1/3 of your game. Story 6. If a game had a bug in it, there was no patching on pre-internet connected systems. They might fix it for future production runs of the disc or cartridge, but unless you bought an updated copy, you were stuck with it. Some games on the Nintendo 64 required an expansion pack, or else you could not play some of the core game modes. Story 7. When the game does not work, take the cassette out, rub it on your clothes, put it back, and it magically works. Do not ask me why. Story 8. The terror of Red Ring. Tape loading error. Your older brother taping over your games while trying to record the top 40 singles chart from the radio. Rubbing and rotating the batteries in your Game Boy, trying to get another 10 minutes of Tetris out of them. Gunrunner. The entire game is difficult. Story 9. Inability to save was a major problem. The complexity and depth of some games were challenging. Games like Final Fantasy had a lot of depth and storytelling. However, games with too much depth suffered if they had no save function. You basically had to play through everything again, and you could not remember much. Game quality, in retrospect, was a factor. It was a factor in a way we didn't understand at the time. Now that we have the ability to do more complex computing, better detailed graphics, and deeper storylines, games have become far more immersive. Another issue with games back then that has a seamless resolution now is where and when you can play them. Old games were always connected to a television. We didn't have spare monitors unless you were wealthy enough to have a spare television. Playing games meant occupying the family entertainment center. The stigma was strong. Just like the introduction of television before it, video games were viewed as a culturally damaging technology that was going to ruin everything. You can argue that however you like, but like any new technology, there were many warnings about it. Most of those warnings came from previous generations worried about its influence, cultural impact, or what it would do to society. Video games were viewed as comic books had been viewed 20 to 30 years earlier. They were considered a source of entertainment for children and a waste of time. Back when arcades were popular, before the dominance of home consoles, video game arcades were seen as drug dens and places of ill repute. This was true in the late 1970s, early 1980s, and even into the early 1990s. Similar to shooting pool, people thought there was trouble in River City. I am old enough to have seen the rise of video games. I was born before arcades became common. I heard complaints from my parents about hanging out in arcades and shooting pool. I find it interesting how integrated video games are in today's culture. They are neither good nor bad. I enjoy them because I find them entertaining. My children like them because they provide an opportunity to engage and play with their friends. It isn't physical play, but they are still socializing and get physical play elsewhere. But I do understand. There are people who are too deeply involved. Some people use gaming as their only social interaction or activity. For some, it may be their only activity outside of work. That is not healthy. It has certainly been interesting to watch. Story 10. Gaming rumors were often impossible to verify. The most memorable one involved a Pokemon game. The rumor stated that if you moved the truck, you would find a Mew. Story 11. Do you remember the Dr. Cartridge, which was basically rubbing alcohol and a plastic stick with a chamois covering? Story 12. In Dune 2, a real-time strategy game by Westwood Studios, you could not draw a square to select all your units. You had to select them one by one with your mouse. Story 13. $1.99 per minute tip lines to call when you were stuck and cannot figure out what to do next. Parents loved those. Story 14. Screen peeking, losing your memory card, blisters on your palm from the Nintendo 64, no automatic save, and most importantly, no load times. Story 15. Games were not as multi-platform and many would not run on any system you could purchase at all. With some games, you had to go to your friend's house to play a game you liked and hope they were in the mood to play and willing to let you play too. With other games, you had to ask your parents to take you to the arcade, where you patiently waited your turn as all the other games beckoned you and your time was limited. Then you had to spend actual money to play the game and more each time you died or lost. People watched and judged you for performing poorly, and they were mean about it because they were waiting their turn and wanted you off. Also, walkthroughs and guides were much harder to come by. For certain games, no one knew how to get past a certain point. Story 16. Early digital rights management was interesting. Some games required you to search the manual line by line for a particular word. Compact disc cracks were common and often included really cool music, but they did not always work and some were viruses. I remember finding patches for my games in copies of PC Gamer. During local area network parties, we would have issues if we were not all on the same version. Cheating was also much easier. I was genuinely shocked when I was the last to discover that my old school friends were all cheating in Counter-Strike. They all had custom models with large boxes that revealed players' locations and the direction they were aiming. It was an interesting time to look back on. Story 17. If you did not know what you were doing, installing a disk operating system game could actually render your personal computer unusable, making it only capable of running the said disk operating system game and nothing else, requiring a full hard drive reformat to fix. Story 18. Having to create your own autoexec.bat file on a floppy disk to adjust the memory allocation just to play the game. Story 19. Editing config.sys and autoexec.bat to get a game to run. Do I need a mouse driver for this? Maybe if I remove the sound card driver, it will work. Story 20. Loading from tape. Not installing, loading. Every time. It was common to go over 30 minutes, and pushing up to an hour was not unheard of. There was no progress saving. Story 21. Spending weeks to complete a game, and the only reward is some happy music, the screen flashing briefly, and then the game starting over. Story 22. A bad translation can make for a very difficult game. Of note is Castlevania 2, where no one in a million years would know to kneel beside a wall for 10 seconds to summon a tornado to whisk you away. Apparently, the Japanese original had much clearer instructions. Story 23. We used to pay $80 for low-quality games with about 10 hours of content. If there were bugs, there were no patches available. It is surprising that people are complaining about Mario Kart. Story 24. Picture this. You cannot save your progress. Your gaming console is attached to the television in your parents' room. You have been playing all day and all night and are on the very last level of Mega Man 2, and your parents want to go to bed and ask you to leave. You are still sad to this day about that lost opportunity. Story 25. The biggest problem I remember was that many games were much more cryptic about what you were supposed to do or where to go. I remember being a kid and getting new Nintendo Entertainment System games and not being able to get past the first level or getting stuck early in the game. There was also almost no information available about most games. If Nintendo Power did not have a guide, you were out of luck. No YouTube videos to watch, no game wikis or walkthroughs, not even official Prima guides in those days. If you played Home Alone 2 Lost in New York and did not know you had to wait for about 5 minutes for the elevator at the end of the first level while dodging objects flying at you from the side of the screen with no instructions, you would just have to accept that you would never be able to play the game. I am not bitter, I swear. Dick Tracy 2. Story 26. Some games came on audio cassette. They would take 15 minutes to load, spend the entire time making noise at you, and often fail, requiring you to start the process again. Story 27. Many games did not have unlimited lives like most games do now. You could make it all the way to the last level, and if the final boss defeated you enough times to use all your extra lives, you had to start completely over. That was frustrating. Story 28. Turn to page 34 in the game instruction book and type the fourth word in the second paragraph to continue playing. Alternatively, use the code wheel to look up a code. Getting disk operating system games to work with sound cards and limited memory was a doctoral thesis in troubleshooting. Story 29. I am from a developing country. My uncle came from the United States of America and brought a pawn-shop Nintendo Entertainment System with Super Mario and The Legend of Zelda Golden cartridge. He went straight to me, 11 years old, and my brother, 9 years old, and said, "This is for you." But Grandma was sitting semi-permanently with my aunt's son, 3 years old, and said, "What about him?" Uncle looked back and said, "It is for everyone." We went home and played, but the next day at noon, Grandma was there to take the unit because it was her son's turn. For reference, she looked like Coco's tamale grandma. I love the movie but hate her scenes. So yeah, probably not even gamers from back then would understand. Story 30. Having to leave the console on for a few days to complete the game was challenging. My parents did not allow me to occupy the only TV we had for hours, and I had younger siblings who wanted to watch children's programs. I got about 1 hour per evening if I finished my homework, or 2 hours per day on weekends when my parents did not mind. There was no way to save your game progress early on. Story 31. Resolution was not much of a choice back then. Hands get bigger, but the controller stays the same size. Story 32. Using several floppy disks to install and run a game. If one disk broke, the game was over. They were not even floppy. Story 33. Early online play was often a headache. Instead of connecting through a server hosted by others, for some games you would connect directly to the other person's computer by typing in their internet protocol address. In my experience, this usually involved a 20-minute troubleshooting session where both people had to check their network settings, make sure their ports were open, ensure they were both using transmission control protocol/internet protocol or user datagram protocol, verify firewalls were letting the game through if you even had a firewall back then, search the internet for advice, and try commands like IP protocol configuration renew. After you figured it all out, sometimes it would mysteriously stop working the next session. In the dial-up modem days, a few games even offered direct modem-to-modem connections. You would connect through each other's personal phone lines, as opposed to using the modem to first connect to an internet service provider and then to the other person through the internet. This was not specific to games. Anytime you used a dial-up modem, it occupied the phone line, so you sometimes ran into issues where a family member would pick up the phone and disrupt your connection, or they would ask you to get off because they needed to make a call. Hopefully, you had a second line in your house. I still ran into this problem sometimes even with 2 lines. Continuing the topic of online play, there was a period when online connections were only possible through personal computers, well, for the general public anyway. I remember being impressed when I first heard the Xbox would come with a built-in modem, or maybe it was the GameCube. They both supported it around the same time. A console with an internet connection was quite a breakthrough. Some early PC and Macintosh games used a form of copy protection where you had to look up a word from a page in the physical manual at the start of the game. Almost no software came with digitized manuals back then. The original Macintosh version of Prince of Persia comes to mind as an example. Other games forced you to keep the compact disc in the drive to play them, even if they installed everything on the hard drive. StarCraft was this way. The social environment was different as well. In the old days, if you got stuck in a game and could not figure out where to go next, and you had already asked your older sibling and best friend but they did not know, you were basically out of luck. If you did not figure it out, you were just stuck. Unlike today, where even the most obscure game probably has multiple YouTube playthroughs and written guides with screenshots, and in the worst-case scenario, you can ask on the Steam community page. Some old games had physically published strategy guides or walkthroughs. There was the Nintendo Power Hotline you could call for advice, and for the exceptionally dedicated, there were newsgroups and IRC chat rooms that might be able to help. Game FAQs has been around since 1995. The experience of getting stuck in a single-player game in the 90s seems very different compared to now. The lesser internet presence also allowed game rumors and urban legends to flourish in a way that is not possible now. A kid could tell you, if you beat Super Metroid without dying once, you get to see a nude of Samus at the end, and you could not just hop on Google to confirm that was false. I remember someone telling me you could hold 4 guns at once in GoldenEye if you put the right code into a Game Shark. I know you could dual-wield most weapons with the all-guns cheat. Game urban legends still exist. Minecraft seemed to have had a number of them, but it is just a little less common now. One other hyper-niche bit of online gaming history. In the early days of Battle.net, StarCraft players had 3 superstitious rituals. First, hold F5 to speed up the download when downloading a new map from the host. Second, if no one was joining your game, everyone would tell the host to close and reopen all the player slots, supposedly to refresh the game's listing for other prospective players or to move it higher. Third, to also refresh the game listing, the host would type /refresh or /relist in the chat. All of these did nothing, but people insisted everyone do them. Story 34. My UNRAR doesn't work. Huh? Are you sure you have the right password? Yeah. Co0 keycatcher 46, right? Yes, that should work. It only works with the first floppy. Oh, you need to add -faz/save game 4000. That doesn't work either. I have to play the new Leisure Suite, Larry. Do you have another set of discs I can copy? Story 35. Moving forward, encounter an enemy. Walk back as enemies behind you spawn because the game essentially resets when you exit and return to it. This was super annoying in older games like Castlevania. Story 36. There really were not many reviews of games in the old days. There were a few magazines, but not everyone had them. Most of the time, you just bought a game because it looked cool at the shops or it was from a publisher you knew. It was kind of a gamble whether the game was something you would like or not. I own several good classic games, but I also owned plenty of bad ones that I hardly ever played past the first attempt. Nowadays, it is a lot easier to avoid spending money on a bad game in the first place since reviews are everywhere. Story 37. Manually adjusting your autoexec.bat and config.sys files because PC games had complicated requirements back in the day. In retrospect, I have no real idea what the difference between extended and expanded memory was, but I knew how to switch from using one to the other. Story 38. Your computer would have 640 kilobytes of random access memory, and you needed about 632 kilobytes to run the game you wanted. You had to do all sorts of things to reduce the size of your kernel in memory. Even after 1 megabyte and 2 megabyte systems came out, that additional memory was on top of the 640 kilobytes, so many games still had to tweak memory to work. You needed the floppy disk at some point during the game to continue. You needed the manual that came with the game for some anti-piracy code. Game bulletin boards were rare, and when you found them, you often needed long-distance phone calls which people could not afford. So if you got stuck, you might just end up finding a new game if you could not get answers. Once you added sound and 3-dimensional video cards, you had to adjust dip switches on motherboards to avoid interrupt request conflicts. When your game locked up, you had to reboot. There was no way to kill the task. Some games came with physical maps that you really needed to play. When Color Graphics Adapter came out, it was awesome for whole colors. Then Enhanced Graphics Adapter came out, 16 colors. When 3-dimensional graphics came out, the difference was mind-blowing. I remember seeing MechWarrior 2 at Comdex in 1997, which I got the army to pay to send me to. Seeing it on a Voodoo 3-dimensional card was really mind-blowing. I have not seen revolutionary graphics like that since. Story 39. Modifying configuration system file to load all your drivers, while maintaining enough conventional random access memory free to run the game. Story 40. Before the internet became widely available, game guides were popular, often found in magazines. I remember not being able to afford guides from grocery stores or bookstores. I wrote down everything I could read, from combos to strategies and cheats. I am sure there was a smarter way to approach this. Story 41. Not every game used the same default button configuration. Developers were still trying to figure out what felt most natural and what worked. One game used the WASD keys, another used the ESDF keys, and another used the QWES keys. Crouch was assigned to several buttons, from the normal control key to Shift, C, and even left Alt. Sprint was assigned to Shift, Control, Z, and even Caps Lock in one game, I swear. Took a while for the industry to sort itself out. Story 42. I was stuck in Hugo's House of Horrors 2. I had to mail away to buy the hint book, and the day it came in the mail, I was so excited. Now just look it up. Story 43. If a game had bugs, you were stuck with a bugged game. There were no updates at that time. However, at least the games were complete upon release. Story 44. Manually setting your Internet Protocol version 4 address and subnet mask so that you and your friends can have a local area network party and play against each other over wired Ethernet. Story 45. Not having a minimap or quest tracking for everything. Old games focused more on paying attention naturally to the game world. New games primarily happen through the user interface while you notice the 3D environment peripherally. Story 46. Most of my ideas have already been mentioned, but one I did not see is corded controllers. We are spoiled today by wireless technology. In the past, you had a limited distance you could be away from the television unless you used specialty extensions. Story 47. This was exclusive to personal computer gaming. Larger games in the late 1980s and early 1990s came on multiple floppy disks. Sometimes one of those disks would have a red error, and you would select retry or abort repeatedly, hoping it would work. If it did not succeed, you were out of luck because there was no easy way to download a replacement disk. Story 48. There was no internet. You could not search how to beat XYZ game level 4 boss. You could not find a forum like Reddit to talk about it with other gamers. You talked about it with your friends at school or nobody if your friends did not all have the same game. There were physical printed books and magazines that included walkthroughs for popular games, which you would buy with your allowance. Nowadays, there has been a lot of research, much of it trial and error, about what makes a game fun and how to introduce a learning curve that challenges players but lets them pick up skills at a reasonable rate. If the game explained how to use a new weapon or tool, one full sentence would be considered a lot of detail. There is probably a short paragraph in a printed manual that came with the game. It is customary in games today to give you a low-pressure opportunity to practice or play with a new power-up. That was not a given, you just kept your player running. Games back in the day had no chill. They threw you in the deep end. Your character might be able to take 2 hits or maybe just one before you would die and have to restart the level. Some games were just comically unfair and were considered hard, as opposed to it being a failure on the game's part. You just had to get good or give up or buy a game enhancer. Story 49. Having to use advanced memory management techniques to load drivers into high memory areas to leave enough base memory to load the non-Windows or disk operating system game, and then hoping the video and sound cards you had were supported. Story 50. Apparently, not having autosave is a problem. My child picked up my Nintendo DS and keeps losing progress because she forgets to save manually. In my day, we did not have the save option at all. Story 51. Having to buy a guidebook if you were truly stumped and could not figure something out. At that point, you either had to buy a guidebook or hope your friends had the answer. There was no looking up things on phones sitting right next to you. Story 52. Creating a boot disk to free up enough memory so the game could run. Then having a tray for floppy disk specific to rebooting to launch certain games. Story 53. Getting your sound to work. If you set your interrupt request and direct memory access settings wrong, it would lock up your system. Also, different games had different memory requirements, so you needed different config.sys configurations. If you played Ultima 7, you even had to use its own custom memory manager, which I think was called the Voodoo Memory Manager. After 1995, with Windows 95, you had to deal with DirectX. Back then, some games required DirectX 3, while others needed DirectX 5. Some DirectX installations would mess up other games. It was a real mess. Story 54. 2-player Mortal Kombat with both players using the keyboard. Simultaneous key presses could lock out the other player. Story 55. Before Windows, there were 2 levels of memory: conventional memory and upper memory. You had to free up more of the upper memory to run certain games using disk operating system commands. Story 56. You do not have Wikipedia or any other resource, and you also do not know how to play that game. It is funny and boring when you waste hours trying to go to the next level or solve puzzles. Story 57. Oof. Motion sickness. Not a lot of games because of these days, but back then I would have these horrible compound headaches that wouldn't go away for days. I loved gaming and played anyway, to my detriment. The original Spyro the Dragon killed me. Glover. The original Glover for Nintendo 64 was a game I remember loving. It was released on Xbox and I played it for an hour before getting a tinge of those familiar headaches I haven't had in over 17 years. I haven't played it again. A later PlayStation 2 game, Rugrats in Paris. That one was so bad that even hearing its music would cause psychosomatic symptoms of brain fog and pain. I am still a gamer and bad games are few and far between now. Story 58. 20 minutes or more to load the game on a ZX Spectrum. Also, I remember a desert bike game that would literally crash if I crashed the bike in a sand dune. That was a real hard mode in a computer game. Story 59. Limited save space. Not knowing how a level is finished, but not yet having walkthroughs available. Buying a North American television system committee game in a phase alternating line region. Games not being frame rate independent on personal computers. Story 60. Having to connect that radio frequency switch to the antenna of older television sets. Sometimes the hooks would break, so you had to scrape a bit of the plastic to expose the wires. Story 61. Playing 4-player GoldenEye with the screen divided into quarters. Players who complain about screen peaking lose their turn in the rotation. If you cannot do it, it is a skill issue. Get a copy from Blockbuster and improve. Story 62. The gunslinger days of 1990s fighting games in game arcades and the rivalries within them were memorable. The Street Fighters, Mortal Kombat's, X-Men and the Marvel vs. series, Darkstalkers, Killer Instincts, and numerous other fighter games called out from the dark halls of game arcades, VHS rentals, and bowling alleys everywhere. The courtesy second rounds that you would give a challenger, usually a friend who borrowed quarters from you, if you beat them in the first round, extended the battle and drama to 3 rounds so you would each get your money's worth from the arcade game's coin-thirsty gameplay. There was also the occasional upset that came with the gamble. Not to mention the constant threat that a stranger could walk up, join in, and end your game if they got the better of you. Story 63. Someone calling and call waiting knocks you off the internet and disconnects you from your really fun match where you are in first place, doing better than you have ever done before. Story 64. Games sold with bugs that, for logistical reasons, cannot be fixed because the games were physical entities. Story 65. Having a game that only has one save file, and your sibling overwrites your near-endgame save with their own new save. Story 66. The game would at best tell you where and who to talk to, and you figured it out by talking to random people. Story 67. Not having to wait 5 hours for an update because you have not played that game in a while, or having to wait for the game to load before playing. I can start playing the moment I turn on my console. Story 68. When there was a bug, you just had to deal with it. There was very little way to get an update or patch. Story 69. Some game cartridges used a battery to keep their save game memory functional. Once those batteries failed, you could no longer save your game. My Legend of Zelda cartridge has not been able to save for almost 20 years. Story 70. Having to correctly load sound drivers for a game in disk operating system. If you did not have the instructions, you simply did not have sound. No internet meant you were out of luck. Story 71. Finding a server you enjoy with people you like is important. It was great that no one would ban you for saying, Taiwan is better than China. Story 72. Having to figure out everything yourself. If you were lucky, you had friends who were playing the same game, and you could compare notes on how to do things. If you were very lucky, the video game magazine had tricks, tips, hints, and sometimes cheat codes for the game you were playing. All of that information is now very easy to find online. Story 73. Lack of a standard in control schemes and intuitive user experiences that do not require manuals anymore. Back in the day, especially during the Nintendo 64 and PlayStation era when comfortable two-dimensional platformers were abandoned, every game tried something different to figure out what to do. There was no real standard. What might be cancel in one game was confirm in another, and look down in a different one. Games did not have tutorials, so players needed manuals to learn how to play. There is a famous review of an Alien game for the PlayStation where the reviewer said, "The scariest thing about this game is the controls." They then proceeded to describe modern shooter controller controls. While this is hilarious in retrospect, at the time, it is a good example of just how varied and lacking in standards controls were back then. Story 74. Not having the internet to patch bugs meant that if a game shipped broken, it was just broken. Looking at you, Daggerfall. Story 75. Not having any official or reliable guides to help you through the game, and instead relying only on playground rumors. Story 76. Arcade games designed to waste quarters are being ported to consoles. These games had major difficulty spikes. Games were launched to coincide with a movie release. Games nobody could beat without a Game Genie include Battletoads and Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles. Story 77. Needing the booklet to get a code to progress. Looking at you, Star Tropics. In a similar fashion, old disk operating system and personal computer games required you to enter a word or phrase on a specific page to install. Story 78. Multiple compact discs for one game, requiring switching during a game session. Damaging cartridges, placing them in the freezer, or cleaning with alcohol. Codes for save points. Story 79. You cannot see the 3 plugs in the back of your television that weighs 87 pounds and is 36 inches thick. It is sitting in a cabinet with 2.5 inches of clearance on the sides to reach behind. The plugs feel identical and the order matters. Story 80. You bought a game, that was it. No downloadable content. No bug patches or fixes. No updated rosters. You paid a price for a game and that was it. Story 81. Swapping discs every time you went to certain areas was annoying. Non-winnable states were common in 1980s adventure games. You could miss something the game does not tell you, and hours later you learn you cannot win. King's Quest V was the master of this. Terrible stuff. Story 82. You could not look up anything on the internet. You had magazines and guides for some games. Otherwise, we would spend hours and days trying to figure out Rigor, Battle of Olympus, Legacy of the Wizard, you name it. Story 83. Not having enough free conventional memory to start the game without using your special game boot disk. Story 84. Having to click repeatedly to increase a counter. In Fallout 1, paying for things towards the end of the game could give you tendinitis. Story 85. M386. Basic input-output system. Sound card interrupt settings. Enhanced graphics adapter graphics. Ripping operating system disks so you could actually run the software you did not steal. Story 86. Dad came back from Singapore in the late 1980s with a Nintendo Entertainment System. It had no English translation, so we never knew what to do, but we worked it out. Multiplayer Quake 2 back in the dial-up days, and an incoming call would disconnect me. Story 87. Having to figure out the game instead of being able to search for solutions if you encountered a problem. Some games provided phone numbers for help, which could cost several dollars per minute, and you were likely to wait at least a few minutes before speaking to anyone. Other times, you might get lucky and find a magazine or a game guide to assist you. If none of these options were available, you either had to find a friend who knew or figure it out yourself. Very few games had any form of a save game system. Some games had codes to use after completing a level, but you had to finish the level to get the code. The first game I remember with any sort of save game system was Ghostbusters on the Commodore 64, where you received a code if you managed to beat the game, which was very difficult. Entering that code the next time you started would let you begin with more money to make the game slightly easier. The first real save game system I recall was with Wolfenstein 3D, which had proper save and load features, along with quick save and quick load. Many early console games, such as those for the Nintendo Entertainment System and Sega Genesis, had no saving features, and the games were often very long and difficult. I never finished Super Mario Bros. 3 despite having a Game Genie cheat device because I could not get through the last world to reach Bowser, due to having to turn off the console or others wanting to play. Story 88. 1. Not having a world map in the corner until you discovered the area yourself or found a map in the game. Having to follow clues and talk to non-player characters to gain information on where to go to do a side quest. We did not have giant arrows to follow. Also, having absolutely no idea what to do next because all tasks have been done and quests completed. What did I miss? I guess I have to go back and chat with everyone again. Buying a complete game. That is it. No extras, downloadable content, or updates. Just buy the game, play the game, give the game to a friend. Story 89. The unusable lag on a 56 kilobits per second dial-up modem. Wait, were there consoles worth gaming on? Sorry, I was playing Doom Deathmatch on a personal computer with 56 kilobits per second. Story 90. Being very difficult because they were arcade ports designed to consume quarters. Imagine beating Bloodborne with 3 lives and 1 or maybe 2 hits before death. Story 91. Having to search for patches on release websites instead of relying on automatic updates, and some modifications were extremely difficult to install. Story 92. Losing the manual means you don't have the unlock codes needed to start the game. The codes were not listed on one page. Instead, they were scattered throughout the manual. Story 93. Having to get a game patch from technical support sent on a floppy disk. Never did get the mass driver in Outpost to work. Story 94. From the 1980s, getting software distributed via a Ziploc bag. Not pirate software, software you would buy from a professional personal computer store. Spending hours typing in the program from the magazine into your Apple II or Commodore computer, and then watching it crash when you tried to run it. Then going through the code, agonizingly looking for your typos. Spending time learning how to create your Hangman game or your Fahrenheit to Celsius conversion program, and then loading up Space Vikings and realizing you had a long way to go before you were a good programmer. Space Vikings, by the way, was a great game on the Apple II. I am still kind of amazed at the longevity and pedigree of Microsoft Flight Simulator. It started out as the Sublogic Flight Simulator for the Apple II. Flying my Sopwith Camel over a wireframe ground toward mountains I would never reach was an amazing experience. Amazingly enough, the skills I learned in that program on how to fly and land still apply today. Simulators only. I am not a real pilot. Story 95. 90% of games were poorly designed, and you rarely had any clue what to do. It was not until the Nintendo 64 and Sony PlayStation that developers began providing in-game instructions. Otherwise, you had to make sense of the manual. Story 96. I never dealt with this as an Amiga user, but personal computer gamers had to worry about interrupt requests. It was ridiculous the difficulties they had to endure to get low-quality looking and sounding games running. Story 97. Sometimes you would go to play a game and it just would not work. You would do things like blow on the connectors of the cartridge, use a cotton swab and some rubbing alcohol to try to remove dust, or have your dad buy a cleaning kit from the video store. It still would not work. You had to find something else to do. The next day, it just works. Story 98. Memory cards for consoles were common before hard drive space became available, and they had very limited capacity. I remember having a stack during the PlayStation 1 and PlayStation 2 era, including a cool GameShark one shaped like a shark and a Lara Croft one that was a favorite for obvious reasons as a teenager. Story 99. Games were much harder back then. Games like Battletoads get all the attention, but many side-scrollers and platformers were really unforgiving on early consoles because of the mechanical, not-so-fluid movements of characters and vehicles, as well as unforgiving enemies. I feel like I was better at games growing up than I have ever been as an adult. I have witnessed and marveled at how much easier and more forgiving games have become in my lifetime. Story 100. Not having the internet to look things up meant you relied on friends, magazines, and perhaps the local game shop to figure out things you could not. Story 101. For PC games, you had to configure each game to work with your graphics card and sound card. You needed to know what hardware you had and what it was similar to in case your game did not include an exact match of settings. Story 102. How it felt to play a shooter in three-dimensional for the first time. How it felt to open a door to a toilet and see an alien urinating. And lastly, how it felt to experience rooms stacked over each other, the sudden complexity of levels. Story 103. Having a game that would run maybe 1 out of every 10 times you tried to play it. When it did work, it would become a legendary tale you would tell your brothers because they missed it. You had to go to the swap meet or specialty stores to get books with cheat codes or acquire a Game Shark, which is a device used for cheating or hacking. Felt like you were using black market hardware. Story 104. Instead of being mad when a game slowed down due to setting off a lot of explosions or causing some other form of large chaos, you thought it was cool because you were doing something so extreme it brought the hardware to its knees. Story 105. Running out of continuous paper for the dot matrix printer, which is used instead of a monitor for Adventure Colossal Cave in 1977. Story 106. Sometimes, Nintendo Entertainment System cartridges would not load correctly, indicated by a blinking power LED. You would have to blow onto the cartridge contacts. If done incorrectly, it could corrupt all your save files on games like the original The Legend of Zelda. Do not ask me how I know. Story 107. 640 kilobytes of required free RAM were needed to run a game, so you needed custom configuration and auto-execute files for some games back in the day, like Falcon 4.0, to boot Windows with a minimal set of drivers and other components to keep 640 kilobytes of main memory free. You could have 4 megabytes of memory modules installed, but there was a base memory size you could not get around in the early Windows days. Story 108. I started computer gaming in the early 1980s on an Apple IIE. Then I moved into the personal computer world when I got my first International Business Machines compatible computer. It was a 28612 with 1 megabyte of random access memory. Back in those days, you had to understand interrupt request settings and how to load things like CD-ROM and audio drivers into higher memory so you had enough regular memory to run your games. It was a combination of many things just to get it all to work, but when it did, we thought we were kings. Story 109. When you blow into the cartridge because it does not work, or you scream that the game is cheating and hit the console. Story 110. Pretty much saving. Saving video games was a privilege. Your average parents would not know about them, nor did all kids. So it was normal to replay any game over and over from the beginning, and honestly, you did not mind because that was just how it was. In fact, every single game from back then is left unfinished except for Spyro, but only because I played it recently. Story 111. Everybody is familiar with digital rights management nowadays, like Denuvo or a plethora of various launchers. Now imagine, in order to play a game, you did not need an internet connection but a pirate-themed cryptograph wheel. Story 112. Getting CD keys for the local area network party where we used the same copy of a game to install on all personal computers. Also, start the game on one personal computer, then remove the CD to put it in the next personal computer to start the game, because it checks whether the CD is inserted only at game start. Story 113. Insert a tape cassette into a cassette recorder. Press play. Wait about 5 to 10 minutes while a screeching noise plays from the machine. Your game may then start. If you want to play a different game, start the process again. There is no save game option. Story 114. For games that did not save in any way, pausing the game, turning off the television, coming back the next day or later, turning the television back on, and then finding out it will not unpause, causing you to lose all your progress and restart the system. Story 115. Having to make different boot disks depending on what game you wanted to play to free up basic memory. I had a boot disk that gave me 627 kilobytes free. It was a thing of beauty and was the only way I could get Ultima 7 to run on my old Intel 80286 processor. Oh, and using a program called Disk Doubler that would compress and decompress files on the fly. It fooled my computer into thinking it had an 80 megabyte hard drive instead of only 40 megabytes, which was considered ridiculously big when I got it, so I could install Strike Commander. Story 116. There is no save feature, and the code is a long string that you had to write down. If you wanted to finish a game, you had to do it in one session. I had a ton of Sega Master System 2 games that I have never finished or even seen half of. Story 117. Needing to cross-reference the game manual to get the code or symbol to unlock the game to play it every time it ran. Story 118. Getting patches, bug fixes, and updates to the game through magazines, if ever. Sometimes your game would just be doomed to be a mess because you did not get the magazine with the disc containing the fix, and you also had no idea there would be a fix because that information was not widely released. Story 119. Brutal difficulty. Early platform games required perfection to succeed. Modern games are much more forgiving. Story 120. booting into customized autoexec.bat and config.sys configuration files per game in order to free up enough memory. I remember having 606 kilobytes of free memory after loading all necessary drivers was great. Story 121. The first three-dimensional graphics cards were a second peripheral component interconnect card which accelerated only three-dimensional graphics, with two video graphics array ports on the back, one for input and one for output. You had to run a short video graphics array cable from your normal two-dimensional only graphics output into the three-dimensional card input. Then plug your monitor into the three-dimensional card's output. Story 122. Having to lead shots in first-person shooter games when on 56K dial-up. Damn those low-ping players on cable. Story 123. Having to find the money to buy the game. My dad would leave money out in a little dish atop the fridge. I guess so he wouldn't have to carry it in his wallet all the time. On occasion, I'd take a few dollars from the dish so I could go to the movies or something with my friends and not be left out. I didn't get an allowance, and thinking back, I figure he knew I was taking it the whole time, but he never said anything. I was a good kid. I kept my room clean, did my homework, did my chores, and never got into trouble. So I guess he thought it was fine. Somehow I managed to get a PlayStation. I think someone bought it secondhand for us or something. One day it just showed up. I managed to get a few games from friends and money saved from birthdays and my grandmother, and I loved it. One day, Tomb Raider 3 was released, and I wanted it but didn't have enough money. I wanted to play Tomb Raider 3, so I took the money I knew I'd needed from the dish, $50, the most I'd ever taken, and rode my bike to the local shopping center to buy it. The entire ride there and back, I felt guilty. I'd never taken so much. I'd broken the unspoken truce. What would happen to me? But I wanted to play Tomb Raider 3 so badly. So when I got home and slipped the disc into the PlayStation, all that guilt was washed away when Laura slid into the Incan ruins. I played for hours, lost track of time, and suddenly my father stormed into the room. He wanted to know where his money had gone. I told him I'd bought a game with it. With barely contained fury, he told me to take the game and get his money back. I never rode to the shopping center faster, tears in my eyes the whole way. I got him his money back and didn't go out with my friends for a few months. Eventually, I went to him and sheepishly asked for money to go out with some friends. He pulled his wallet out and handed me a 50, with a stern look at me. After that, I knew I had to ask. I wonder if kids these days experience similar things or if it's just for kids who grew up in the 1980s and 1990s. Story 124. The limited block count of PlayStation memory card. Also, saving a Harvest Moon game when the power went off caused an instant corrupted save file. Thanks a bunch for sticking around till the end of the video. Remember to subscribe, and until next time, stay awesome and goodbye.